Welcome to Bat Therapy, psychology of Batman, superheroes, and other comic book characters. Be a fly on the wall or a bat in the cave, listening in on a friendship built out of a love for talking Batman, comics, and the everyday struggle to achieve mental health and happiness.
We are your hosts, clinical psychologist Dr. Amelia Brown and educator and comic aficionado Keaton Hopkins. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube and social media and find our Patreon at patreon.com/battherapy.
This podcast is about providing education and understanding and is not a replacement for mental health treatment or support. If you're needing help, go to bat-therapy.com for resources. All right, so today is an exciting day for us. When I first started looking into doing a nerdy podcast, I wanted to see kind of what was out there already. And I found the Arkham Sessions podcast, which has Dr. Andrea Letamendi, who's leading it, and thought to myself, wow, this person's super cool and doing all these things. Too bad I'm never going to meet them. Well, she's here. So she was nice enough to actually come and join us for a podcast session. So we're nerding out ×2, both nerd content and just having someone that we think is really cool on here. So she, aside from the podcast, she is a consultant in the popular arts, including with Marvel, DC Comics, and other major players out there. She's done commentary on multiple featurettes by Disney Plus and Warner Brothers Home Entertainment, so you may have seen her out there somewhere already. So Dr. Letamendi, or we'll be talking with her as Drea today, because she was nice enough to say, let's go first names. I want to just open it up to you if there's anything else in terms of introducing yourself you'd like to say.
Thank you so much for having me on the show, Keaton and Amelia. It's such a pleasure to be a part of your show and also kind of like your storytelling, your journey around the crossover, the psychology, mental health, and superheroes world. And there aren't that many of us. So I just want to thank you for bringing me into your space as a guest. And anytime I can talk about psychology and superheroes and related topics, I love doing this. I jump at the chance. I wish this could be my full-time job. So I just want to thank you, and thanks to your listeners for being interested in this and for following along with us today.
So if maybe just to start off with, I know Keaton and I have been really interested in what does it even mean to be a consulting psychologist when it comes to our favorite characters out there. So I'm wondering if maybe you can just start off with what that looks like.
I wish that there was a manual or roadmap or pathway that's like really determined, because if I'm being really honest about my career, I had really little idea, 10, 15 years ago about what I would ultimately be doing with my psychology background, if that makes sense.
Oh, totally.
I started out in, actually I went to grad school for clinical psychology. I was really just so interested in becoming an experimental psychologist, a clinical psychologist who would be pretty grounded and spend most of my time sort of in a lab setting, in a research setting. And I, again, being candid about this, it started to just feel not authentic to me. And in grad school, I was so, I want to say lucky to be going to grad school in San Diego, where a Comic-Con is held. And I started to go to Comic-Con as like just something to do, just, a thing, just a hobby. In like about 2007. And I had already been a huge Batman fan, comic book fan growing up. And in grad school, I sort of had my own identity crisis. It did not feel authentic to be a researcher. It did not feel authentic to sort of be in the ivory tower and be limited and constrained to those professional activities. And I say this with so much respect and in honor of that work that's done in those settings, because I can't do what I do without both my experience and training in as a scientist practitioner, but also the folks that have come before me and that are going to continue to do that really critical work around evidence-based treatments, assessment, and dissemination. So I just really appreciate that that's a space that exists. and my shorter answer to the question is that I started to realize where I can be most effective and also feel that sense of excitement and exhilaration about my work is that translational piece, to bring the science of psychology into spaces where it doesn't have that illumination, doesn't have that that history, or doesn't have that welcoming, or it's just really needed to elucidate the gaps, the practices, the need for this work to be out there. And so podcasting was actually the first way that I've done this. Just get the voice to the people, get the science to the people. That's like one of the first things that I did, is start the Arkham sessions with Brian Ward, my co-host, who isn't here now, but is like definitely, as you all know, a huge part of podcasting is your co-host. And I started to realize that's one really effective way to sort of get my professional voice out there. And then the consulting piece happened. Folks reached out to me as they saw me as an expert in the intersections of mental health and comic books and superheroes. And so then I started to work behind the scenes with artists, creators, developers, folks in the creative arts and entertainment spaces, because they knew that this work is really seminal to their storytelling, and felt like they had someone relatable to go to.
Yeah, that's really cool.
That is really awesome. Which also, by the way, congratulations! You just had your 200th episode
Oh yeah.
for the Arkham sessions. Congrats! It was funny because when I do follow you, and I had actually watched Batman Forever the week before, and so I was really excited when you happened to post it, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, yes, I just watched this." That was the very first Batman movie I think that I saw in theaters, because
Wow.
because I think Batman Returns I was still a little too young, but then when that one came out, so I just thought it was really, really fortuitous that your 200th episode was a movie that I had just extremely fresh on the brain. But yeah, congrats. That is
Thank
so
you.
awesome.
Thank you. It's amazing that we reached 200, because running a podcast, as y'all know, is a lot of work. So much goes on
Yes.
behind the scenes. And even staying on track, not just in terms of schedule, but just the spirit of the show. What are we covering? Do we feel passionate about this? And I will say, we've done other podcasts, we've hosted other podcasts, we've been longtime sort of secondary or co-host to other podcasts, and we keep coming back to our own podcast. And I think it's because it is our baby. We developed it, we nourished it, we nurtured it, and the first 100 or so episodes are all centered around Batman, for folks who recognize the name, the Arkham sessions, or
Such a great name.
Arkham itself. Yeah. So we started out really centering our discussions on Batman the Animated Series. And the origin story of this is that I had just done my first feature film documentary with Warner Brothers. They had me as an on-camera interviewee on villains, and it was lined up with DC Comics. They were doing like a big villains kind of tie-in with all the titles. And
for the new 52.
this was, I believe so, because this is around that
Yes.
time. It was Necessary Evil. So the film is called Necessary Evil, Supervillains of DC Comics. And I was asked to participate in that documentary, and it was one of the first that I did with Warner Brothers. It may have even been the one that kind of started our consulting relationship.
Awesome.
And it was a whole lot of fun. And then, oh my gosh, I was on screen with Jim Lee and Scott Snyder, and just amazing people in the comics industry. And I just felt like, wow, I just felt super humbled by that. And then when the documentary came out, all of my examples came from Batman the Animated Series, and the interstitials and like the little clips they used using my commentary were of Batman the Animated Series. And so my co-host, Brian Ward, who's now my husband, actually, had pitched this to me. Why don't we just do a podcast? You're so excited. You're talking about Batman all the time. Why don't I just put microphones around and we'll create a show?
What is it about the husbands? Mine was also like, hey, people might want to listen to this. And I was like, no, they won't.
That's so fascinating. And I did the whole sort of like, hero's journey refusal to the call. I'm just like, I don't think anyone wants to hear me talk. It's nerdy. I don't think anyone cares about these subjects. And we got going and we not only enjoyed it immensely, but we also gained a bit of like a fan following around Batman and mental health. And so that would be for me, developing the podcast and centering it around Batman as a character and Batman's narrative, Batman's world, villains, relationships, helped me frame the first 100 or so episodes. And since then, because, the show, this is a show from 1992, it did end, and we were put in a position to start to cover other things. And we did expand our lens, and we started to talk about other shows, and we threw in a few films. We threw in the Nolan films. We even covered like a video game. We covered a whole bunch of stuff. And right now we're covering Star Wars, the cinematic Star Wars IP. And it has been hilarious. It's been so much fun, and a little bit of a shift in I think our pop culture lens, but also we're huge Star Wars fans. So it all made sense to us.
It's like a Venn diagram, like if you're into one of them, you're into at least two or three, Star Wars, Star Trek, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings. There's something you can kind of cross over into. You hit on something just now that I think is so important. And I come from the same place of, I felt like I was jumping through all the hoops in grad school. And Keaton's an educator, so he also has a sense of some of this like upper level stuff where you kind of have to jump through hoops to get to the point that you were starting off at in the beginning, to be able to do what you want to do. And I just, I got to this point too where it was just kind of, you don't necessarily see all the information getting out there to people in just the everyday world. And one of the things that really struck me too is, why do we make it so much work? Everything is hard enough as it is. Why make it so that only people who care about mental health are going to learn about mental health? It's kind of like, not everyone who's fit goes to the gym. Maybe they're hiking, maybe they swim, or I don't know, maybe they play badminton. I don't know. But how do we make this stuff accessible to everyone, whether mental health is their quote unquote thing or not? And also, they're not to have to necessarily be a problem in order for someone to learn about it. So that was a lot of what went into our own kind of background in terms of starting the podcast. And I know you were talking about the co-host being so important. It's so true, because I was like, okay, let me just kind of record a thing here and there and see what I think. And I was like, okay, this is interesting stuff. And I kept thinking to myself, but this is a conversation I'd have with Keaton. and it would be better. And making, like you said, making things fun and exciting and interesting. And also just delving into these things that people are passionate about already, and helping them understand what makes them good, but then also sometimes understanding what could maybe make them even better.
Yeah. Well,
absolutely.
It was. I remember when you asked me, I was like, "Are you kidding me?" Like, I feel like I said yes before you even finished asking, because it was one of those things where we've always been friends, and then you asked me, you were like, "Hey, do you want to start a podcast where we talk about Batman?" I'm like, so basically just record us on the phone? Is that what you're
And I said,
is that what you're
exactly,
saying?
yes.
Yeah, because it is one of those things where I feel like it's an escape. Like, I remember so many times when I would be going through hardships in life, I would just go to Barnes and Noble, find a chair, and literally just start reading comic books. And like, I literally read Identity Crisis when I was going through one, right?
Wow.
And so it's one of those things where it is such a good escape, and you can honestly learn so much from these characters and how they interact with each other and how they deal with things. Because uh, what's so cool about superheroes is next to the powers, these are still flawed individuals,
Mm-hmm.
right? No one is perfect, despite what Ozymandias might think about himself. He's certainly not perfect. And so, just being able to kind of immerse yourself in this world and also be taken away from whatever it is you're temporarily going through, it's such a good escape. It's such a great escape, and it's one of those things where looking at my own mental health issues, whenever Amelia did ask me to come on the podcast, I was honestly nervous because it was one of those things like, do I want to put out there that I
Mm.
actually struggle with mental health issues? And at the end of it all, I was like, well, absolutely. I think that's the point. It's being able to just get it out there that, if someone is dealing with something, they're not the only ones dealing with it. They're not alone. And so yeah, it's been an honor to just kind of be a part of this. And on top of that, just pick Amelia's brain because like y'all are y'all are absolutely brilliant, and I just kind of love like half I feel like on the podcast half the time my co-hosting I'm just asking questions like what about this, like what about this,
Mm-hmm.
and it's
But
just so
but
much
you're
fun.
that I think is why the co-host is so important with these things because like Drea was talking about at the beginning, there's a lot of wonderful things happening in research and in these more kind of educational or even treatment settings, but there needs to be almost essentially the audience member who creates the conversation, because if it's just psychologists within psychology, all this wonderful information gets trapped. And I think it's wonderful all the different questions you ask, and you have a very good mind for these sorts of things, even though you didn't go through that training. Not all of it's the training. There's also kind of this innate piece to it. And it was also really cool too, because when Keaton started, I was like, I know you have mental health stuff. This is not me saying you need to tell anybody anything about any of that stuff. We can just talk the comics and the mental health. You get to choose. And I think there have even been moments where afterward we're kind of checking in and it's like, hey, are you still sure that we can always take things out if you
Yeah.
afterward feel like you don't want to share it. But I've loved that part because I think also there's just people I think are becoming more and more comfortable with the conversations, but it's so helpful to know, hey, here's these other nerdy comic book people out there like me, and they also struggle with stuff like I do. And that community piece is just so important.
And that was one thing I was going to ask you, Drea. Like, how is it whenever you go to these huge cons and speak on panels and interact with all of these individuals that just listen to your podcast every week when it comes out? They're just like listening to it. How does it feel actually being able to interact
Mm.
with people all over the country that are just like listening to you on a weekly basis, like knowing that your voice is just out there being heard by so many?
It is hard to get used to. I'm not sure that I am like absolutely comfortable in my skin
Mm.
as all of these different identities because, yes, we are podcasters. We're also educators. We're also, public health educators. We're
Hmm.
also putting our professional and sometimes personal lives into a very public space, either through the podcasting or paneling or events. And I did have a little bit of struggle, I'd say like halfway through. Uh, I didn't know how much of my life should be out there. And
Mm.
Amelia, this
Yeah.
is like kind of how we're trained
Yes.
as psychologists
I was
and
about to say
other mental health
psychologists.
professionals.
Mm-mm.
There's so much of the
Yep.
indoctrinating that, and this is true for other mental health providers too, that we will be better suited as therapists and counselors if we don't put so much of ourselves out there.
Hmm.
And I think we need to subvert that a little bit if we're also seeing ourselves as public health educators and public speakers and thought leaders in these spaces. And so I had to do a little bit of shifting around in my professional identity. Is it okay that my social media is the one? I just have the one, that's telling folks about what I'm doing over the weekend, what article I'm reading, what comic I'm reading, what conference I'm in. And so Keaton, it's interesting because there's a little bit of code switching too that has to be pretty fluid. When I'm at Comic-Con and I'm delivering a panel that's for a Comic-Con audience, the majority of people in the audience are not in the mental health field.
Right.
The majority of that audience, they're Comic-Con they're comic book readers and fans, and it's quite diverse just in terms of who might be sitting in those seats. I recently did a conference. I spoke at a mental health conference in San Diego for a group that was based on talking to them, predominantly mental health providers, social workers, and folks who are working in foster care, child welfare work. And so the shift there is leaning in a little bit more to our industry, right? The language we use, the lingo. And I even get nervous about how I'm representing myself in those spaces and making sure I do right by the other audiences that are not there, right? I'm trying to speak highly of the opportunities to learn and heal from comic books. And so I want to do that in a way that respects and honors the media. And I also want to respect and honor the discipline of clinical psychology. And so how do I intersect that? And I think that where we can really be successful in this is that translational piece, that in our training, we rarely get education and assistance around like communication skills, media skills, entrepreneurship, social media management. We're just flying by the seat of our pants. My social media management was, should I tweet this? I'm not sure. I'm going to put it in my drafts. And then I'm going to wait 6 hours and have some food and then come back to it. Is this still okay for me to tweet? And those are the lessons learned. So my full-time job is actually at UCLA as a clinical psychologist, consultant, and trainer there. And I have the kind of position that I'm not working in the campus clinic. I'm outside of the clinic doing a bunch of implementation work and crisis work. And I meet with a lot of students, typically in that transitional age range, so 18 to 24. And they do ask, how do you sort of start a business and be an entrepreneur and thought leader as a clinical psychologist? And my answer is, there's no manual for this. I have been working on this for my whole career and probably will continue to both struggle with this and celebrate this and pioneer this, because this is not the type of career that exists in our traditions of clinical psychology.
I actually have been trying to write an article, which I'm not good at publishing. I need to get better about that. But trying to write an article essentially about my path to podcasting, and I think hitting on exactly what you're talking about. So anytime there was, so Bill, my husband, was like, hey, you should start like a YouTube channel or a podcast. And I said, absolutely not. I felt like all of the psychology mentors in the entire space of the United States would just turn and throw daggers at me. I was like, no. You're supposed to be invisible out there. But that's and I would assume some of that training might be changing now, but unfortunately some of that stuff can be slower than the actual output of what technology looks like. But nowadays that you can't, first off, you cannot be invisible. And second of all, if you choose to be invisible, you're vastly limiting your ability to impact the public for the better. And one person I was talking to, it was actually someone who is a consulting psychologist as their career. And they said, you know what? Someone's going to put the content out there. So the question is, what kind of quality is it going to be? And that was really helpful for me. And I think one of the attributes, it's not the only one, but one good attribute of high quality work is that you are always questioning yourself. You're never fully confident. You need to be wondering how you were talking about keeping in mind all the audiences, even if they're not there. How do you put things out there in a way that's going to hopefully hit home as best as it can? But yeah, it was tough. I mean, Keaton and I, last season, we did an episode on Professor X, and we were talking about just all his dual relationships and everything going on.
Yeah.
And Keaton, I don't know if you remember this, but essentially, it's talking about in psychology, we tend to want to keep things pretty black and white ethically
Yeah.
and say, separate your worlds. But if you do this kind of work, it sounds like, Drea, you're hitting on the fact that it just,
It all kind of
you
melts
can't.
together.
Yeah, you can't completely separate everything.
Yeah.
It
And
would be more challenging to do that because there may be some people who can have some compartmentalizing of
Mm,
parts of their careers. And I actually do know somebody who is in the entertainment industry as an actor, and also they are a voice actor. So they also can have a private practice in counseling,
see,
and
that's
they are a
smart.
licensed practitioner.
awesome.
And their way of doing this is certainly again unpaved and not
Mhm.
something that is easy to carve out and to craft, but they're fantastic at it. And so I do think that there are many ways to do this, and that's what I celebrate, is that
Mm,
there is not one way to be a clinical psychologist educator.
yeah.
And Amelia, what you said around what happens if I don't do this
Mhm.
is incredibly um, provocative for me,
Yeah.
right? Like in a good way. There are now so many YouTube channels and podcasts and people putting their voice out there. The majority of about mental health, and the
Mhm.
majority of them are not mental health professionals. And
Yeah.
so you're going to have a lot of armchair folks commenting on and analyzing and discussing issues that are in our wheelhouse. And I don't minimize any research or work that they're doing,
Mm-mm.
but I do think that taking our work into those spaces with this kind of confidence that, yes, you can do this and
Mhm.
be still respected by the industry. Yes, this is something that has been evolving in the field of psychology for some time and is a lot more well regarded now than about 15 years ago,
Yeah.
when this sort of thing was sort of frowned upon. So I think we're getting to a place where people know and understand that the intention is for access to this information. The intention is for encouragement around mental health awareness, and ultimately for bettering people's quality of life, which is
Mhm.
in our goddamn ethical code.
Yeah.
So it does, this isn't like doublespeak. It
Yeah.
totally makes sense. And if you put the work into your intentions and into your values around this sort of thing, I feel like there can be a way to balance out the self-doubts, the imposter syndrome, and whatever kryptonite is coming our way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
I do like what you touched on about just how many people, whether they are professionals in the field, are touching on these things. And it was one of those things, every time there will be so many times I ask Amelia, I'm like, hey, is that a proper term? Is that something that people use? Is this language okay? Because there's so much information that's out there. And I mean, you can pull up a random YouTube channel and anyone can talk about
Mhm.
what they, might have read on WebMD, right? But they're not practiced. They're the professional level, the degree, all of that isn't there. And I agree, it's so important to actually have the professionals and like leaders of the field that are in here, like getting involved with this. Because as an educator, I do definitely understand all those different roles that you play. It's always funny when I happen to see a student out in public and they're like, "Oh, why aren't you in the classroom right now? Like, what are
You're
you doing?
human? What?
You're human, right? What are you doing? you're not teaching biology right now. What's happening? Why are you drinking beer? Like, what's going on here, right? And so it's always funny to see those to see that duality, but it's also really cool getting a chance to kind of see it mesh. Like the other day, I was talking to students about how in X-Men 2 there's this scene where Pyro says that the mutant gene is on the male chromosome, and I'm like, well, that can't be right. And I proceeded to tell my students why it couldn't be right, because sex-linked traits, if it was a sex-linked trait on the Y chromosome, then there would only be male mutants. But it's stuff like that that just works. It's like, okay, you just
Mhm.
mixed worlds that I really, really liked, and I'm never gonna forget that. And
Yep.
so it's really interesting how all of these things can work together despite honestly kind of I feel like I grew up thinking these can't be related, right? Like so
Mm.
many times you would hear
Same.
about people reading comic books and it's like, oh, why don't you go do some work, right? Or why don't like what are you doing? You're wasting time, right? And
Right.
now
And that's in a lot of ways, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I think there is less stigma now than there
Yes.
was then around the type of kid that read a
Mhm.
comic book or played
yes.
D&D or watched cartoons specific to
Yes.
like
Mhm.
superheroes. And I appreciate that there's a lot more openness and acceptance of just the geeky lifestyle for youth, but also for adults. We're now the ones writing these films. Like we're the ones
Mm.
who are behind the scenes in the
Yeah.
writer's room creating these stories. And I've never been more proud to be a geek than today in the world we're in now. But I Keaton, your description of the stereotype around comic books is very true when it comes to the assumptions that are made about those stories. Like, well, they don't have any value. They're just people punching and kicking each other, and like, they're just about superpowers. I mean, have you read it? For anyone that says that, it's like, did you not read a comic ever?
Ever.
Did you read X-Men ever? Like,
Right.
because it's all about trauma and community healing and
Mhm.
racism and collective liberation. There's so much there
Yes.
that in our world now we can pull from. And I will share, this doesn't happen often, but there are times when I feel validated, like I feel a small win. Last year, I taught a course. I don't usually have time to teach, but I did teach a course for university on abnormal psychology. And so I purchased all the materials and made sure that my textbook was updated. And in the section on personality disorders, there is a picture of Batman and Superman, like it's probably from, I mean, it was recent because it's Ben Affleck playing
Okay.
Batman, pretty recent. And in the little blurb under the picture, it describes schizoid personality disorder, which I totally disagree with, right?
Yeah.
But it gave me a chance to tell my students, I mean, it was super affirming because here's an example, and it's a fictional
Mhm.
example, and Batman's the example. So it was very celebratory. I was very
Yep.
excited to see superheroes in a very mainstream textbook that's used nationally. But then we had a little debate about it, which I think is really good too.
Yep.
Why did this textbook think that this character has this? Is it just Ben Affleck's Batman, or do we think it's all Batman's?
Mhm.
And why did I, as the professor, as the educator and clinical psychologist, why did I disagree with that assessment? And so it made for an interesting conversation, and it was such a joy. I wish I could teach more, because these are the kinds of things that I would love to talk about more.
Yeah. There's I don't know, there's just so much when it comes to psychology that some of it depends on how you're trained, but I think one of the common themes that might be shifting now, I'm not sure, but there tends to be this discouragement of showing yourself as a person, and I know you kind of alluded to this earlier too. Um, and once again, it depends what your training orientation is, but essentially it's coming from a good place. Don't encroach on the person you're helping. The focus is that person. You need to do your best to not apply your own biases to a situation. You really want to make sure that you have kind of the purest setting for this person. And yet, that's impossible. It's impossible to not have your own biases come in or to not be a person. You walk in, assumptions are made, or there are certain things about you that are clear. You can't be a blank slate completely. And I also just I really over time I really struggled with that a bit because my natural style is like very energetic and wanting to engage people and throwing in those little snippets to once again make mental health interesting. And yes, we're doing the hard work, but how do we add some flair to it to help with that engagement? And I felt like I was doing something wrong because that's showing my personality. But the more I realized you need to be human in that room in order for people to really connect was really important. And I think also when there's education like podcasts or whatnot going out there when you step outside of treatment, once again, like psychologists being human is important. I mean, you want to be thoughtful in what you share and how, and there are certain things you might want to keep private, understandably. But yeah, there's that humanness. And I think comic books and stories are one of the absolute best ways of creating human connection, especially between people that might think they're very, very different from one another.
Absolutely. And I do not do enough clinical work. My private consulting practice is with organizations. So my clients are
Mm,
typically teams of people, but at UCLA, I do meet with students individually, and sometimes we'll have opportunities for some therapeutic relationships in that setting. And like, I'm right now I'm wearing a Star Wars shirt, and
nice.
I have
Nice.
the boys, the Anakin and Obi-Wan at a time when they were getting along. And I'll wear this to work. 10, 15 years ago, I wouldn't never have
Hmm.
Oh
even
gosh.
dreamed of
No.
that.
So
Like
unprofessional, right?
it's unprofessional. I would not be taken seriously. I don't have a position of power. 10, 15 years ago, I would be absolutely um scared, to do
Mm,
this. But I now have several years as a licensed practitioner. I have a position where I have some autonomy and some bit more control over my own self as a professional,
mm,
and a position of power where I don't fret over these things. Again, in this balance of professionalism, I do very much care about the dignity and respect that we have for one another,
mm.
anybody in my working space. So I'm mindful and thoughtful that I'm not gonna wear clothing that has anything that has obscenities or is offensive or anything
Yeah.
like that.
Right.
And like it's so interesting because there are people that may think that X-Men and Star Wars and certain comics are offensive.
Mm,
But in
mhm.
my spaces, people know what they're getting into. Like if you're consulting with me or you're meeting with me, it's on
Be
my desk,
prepared.
it's on my walls. Yeah, like
Yeah.
you're going to see, and we can talk about those things, and I'm open-minded about that, and I'm absolutely okay if you've never even seen a Star War. I
Right.
am totally fine with that. But I have noticed that sometimes it does spark discussion and dialogue. And
Hmm.
Amelia, you really nailed it. This is an acceleration of a connection. Maybe you've not seen this movie that's referenced on my shirt, but maybe you know about Star Wars and we have a conversation about that. Maybe you feel really badly for what happened to Anakin and how people turned away from him and he became a villain, and we could talk about that.
It's a
Maybe
window.
what's
Yeah.
that?
It's a window.
It's absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. I often will say it accelerates connection. And if we're able to connect and relate through a mediated other, so mediated relationships, mediated others, these fictional characters and narratives that are not real, there is a safety to that.
Yeah.
There is trust there. There's learning there, and there is healing there if we find something there that we find to be reparative or restorative, or even just brings up feelings and ideas for us. So even though I don't use it every day kind of in a therapeutic way, I do celebrate opportunities to uplift mediated others as these gateways into knowing more about ourselves and about each other.
Yeah.
So I did have a fun question to ask, and because I I think it's safe to say Batman's probably your favorite superhero, right? Uh, who's your favorite?
For those only listening, there's a lot of Batman
Oh,
memorabilia
yes, there
behind
is.
her.
Excellent, absolutely excellent. I love it. But I was going to ask, who is your favorite villain?
Mm.
Wow. I have a straightforward answer and then a not so straightforward answer.
I like it.
So, yeah, I mean, I know y'all have talked about the Joker on the show previously. I do like the Joker as a villain because of in his portrayal and representation or manifestation in television and film, how contextualized he can be. And I
Mm.
actually wrote a series of articles that in the late 80s, the Joker that we see on screen is the kind of Joker that would be terrifying. A very sort of anti-capitalist dude whose methods include going into a museum and defacing art.
Yes.
That's threat in the 80s. That was super threatening. It was to subvert the elite, to subvert capitalism, to be how would we call sort of like very loud, visually very loud,
Yeah.
and of
So in the
course
2020s, we're like, come on, Joker, we're on board.
yeah. Well, and so like we see, I think, an evolution, but also a very
That's
contextualized
interesting.
villain. And we see this in the comic books too. And most, when people ask me, my favorite version of the Joker is from the animated series because
Mm.
Ah,
of
yes.
his connection to his own adrenaline addiction, that
Yeah.
his whole psychology is about the feelings that can come up from violence, anarchy, closeness
Mm.
to the heroes. And there's something to that that I think is actually quite relatable, but also in the context of the animated series, pretty contextual. The animated series is about Bruce Wayne and his relationships. And so the person who's attacking and violating those values is this person who's, if I can, lend itself to clinical psychology, has some borderline tendencies and has inappropriate, unhealthy relationship tendencies and behaviors. My not so straightforward answer is that I really, really love creatures and monsters. And so Killer
Mm.
Croc is one of my favorite characters, not included
Keaton
and written about
loves
enough.
Killer Croc.
I do. I love me
Oh,
some Wayland.
okay.
I love me some Waylon Jones. I
Waylon
do.
Jones is my
I
boy.
do. I really like him. He's had a tough break. He has. Yeah. Uh, but go ahead.
Do you have like a favorite? Do you have a favorite version of Killer Croc?
Mm.
Um,
Comics, movies?
You know, one of my favorite episodes of Batman the Animated Series is when Killer Croc he gets taken in by the people at the circus, and for just a little while it's almost like he has a family, but he still
Mm.
ends up walking away from it, but I'm like rooting for him so bad. So yeah, I think the animated series Killer Croc I really like, and then the Batman Arkham games. They did
Yeah,
they
yeah.
did Killer Croc really well and gave him a really cool side story in Arkham Knight that I really enjoyed because it was basically all about how he was forced to be an animal. In the side story they were experimenting on him and made him even more reptilian than he already was, experimenting on him, and basically he's almost having this conversation with Batman like, they did this. I should be allowed to be this way. And it's just
Mm.
it's one of those things. He's a very heartbreaking character, and you really really feel for him because he's 10 feet tall, but
Yeah.
he's still a human being. He's a very cool character.
I love stories about Killer Croc. Do you know if there's a One Bad Day one shot coming out of Killer Croc?
I don't think they're doing Killer Croc for the One Bad Day, and I'm really,
Oh.
really upset that
Maybe
they
because all
are.
his days are bad days.
They're all bad
No.
days. They're all bad days. I know. He has a tough break. He always just has bad days. That's just his thing. And he just he wants to be left alone. Like honestly,
Yeah.
like it seems like modern day Croc, he wants to be left alone. I loved when they randomly put him in Red Hood and the Outlaws. He was Roy's sponsor in AA. It was
Really?
yeah,
Yes.
out of nowhere. It's like the most random thing, but he just shows up and he's like, he's a pretty good sponsor too. And it's just he's a fun character, but he's also a character I think everybody can relate to in just like constantly being misunderstood and having
Absolutely.
nothing to do with that anger that he has because of it.
Absolutely. I love that. This concept that if you treat me like an animal,
Yes.
I will fulfill, some of those
Yes.
expectations,
Mhm.
but you've pushed me to manifest my anger and rage. I
Mm.
think Killer Croc is about the expression and living in rage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, I think, for a lot of us has some resonance. What do I do with the combination of abandonment, misunderstanding, and rage?
Yeah.
And so I even wonder if, like, for a lot of us who like Killer Croc, it's not a sympathy thing. We're not like, oh, feel bad. It's this
Right.
sense of like, I want him liberated. I want
Yeah.
him to find belongingness. I want him to bite people's heads off because it's
Yeah.
like I see that rage within him. I can't recall the actual writer, but there was a comic a few years ago where a family took him in. It was like a couple, or I don't know if it was like husband, wife. They wanted, it was almost a My Fair Lady concept, like we're
Hmm.
gonna
Oh,
take
that's
you
fun.
in and you're gonna be whatever's. And then and he acted, initially he was receptive, but ultimately the result was sort of horrific. And there was this, and I think it's still in this comic I'm referencing, where he's chained up, and he bites off his own hands
Oh,
to
Oh,
get
wow.
out of those chains. And I'll never forget sort of the horror and the rage, and also the some weird justification of this trauma.
Mhm.
I will actually harm myself in order to be liberated and continuously still be in this body um that's going to be constantly seen as dangerous. There's so much packed in there. And if you have a good writer who gets it, you have these stories like this where it's not
Mhm.
meant to be a one-off, like throwaway, oh, filler, because BTAS had a lot of episodes that were filler, and we
yeah.
didn't know what to, in the show, we did not know what to do with those. But anytime you have um characters like Killer Croc and Baby Doll, and like their concept of the world, I think that's where you have such rich psychology to work from. And again, in a
Yeah.
space where we can be vulnerable and real, and not worry about um, the lack of safety if we're actually talking about ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really, really cool. Yeah. Oh wow. That makes me happy. There's
Another Killer Croc
another
lover.
Croc fan out there because I really yeah I've always really loved him. I love Batman's rogues gallery. I think is what makes Batman so interesting at times. Like a lot of times I'll say it, and I feel like you see it a lot in movies. If you can stick a good villain, you can stick the landing for a solid movie. You know, whether we're talking
Mm.
about James Bond or the MCU or DC, you know, so many times it comes down to a very interesting and sometimes charismatic villain. And you know, Batman's villains do that so well because so many times it almost seems like they're dichotomous. Like Batman were to overanalyze things, he would almost become Riddler-esque. And you know, if
Mm.
he got what his relationships that he does has, you know, that are so close to him that he's willing to do anything for, It kind of reminds me sometimes of Mr. Freeze. And so it's funny,
Hmm.
like looking at Batman facing these villains that he definitely shares things in common with. And it's so fun thinking about it, because in a real world, with if in a real world, if there was an Arkham that wasn't corrupt, there's a huge possibility that Batman would be in there as well.
I mean,
I
Batman
I
could
would
use a
just I do not
therapist.
disagree with that.
Yeah.
Now you see, I mean, I love talking about this stuff with Keaton and Drea. It's been really fun having you join us too. I know that you have other things you have to get to, so we definitely want to be mindful of your time. I hope before we wrap things up, though, if we can do a mindful nerd moment together, just to kind of,
Absolutely.
we like doing these because once again, it hits on all these things that we've been talking about, which is how do you bring psychology to the people? And my hope is it's kind of one of those things where either people who want to like mindfulness but they struggle with it, or people who may not be interested in it but maybe we do something fun or silly or interesting, just helping pull people toward understanding it a little bit better, because I think it's a term that's out there so much, almost to the point where some people are like, okay, that mindfulness thing, whatever. It's like, hey, sometimes it can actually be really useful. Let's use our fun characters to look at it. So what I thought we could maybe do today is, I know we all grew up loving Batman the Animated Series. So I figured we would return to our roots here. And I thought what we could do is just imagine ourselves back when we were kids, and you turn on the TV and there is Batman the Animated Series starting up. So just imagining yourself watching that intro, really just taking in the moment as a child again. So if you guys are comfortable, I'd like for you to close your eyes, but if not, you can always just soften your gaze, not looking at anything in particular, sitting straight but comfortably. And first, I want you to just take a few deep breaths. Just using your breathing to help you focus in on my voice and to help you concentrate on what we're about to do. And as I described, I want you to picture yourself as a child, wherever you would normally be when you turn on that television and get ready to watch Batman the Animated Series. And I want you to imagine that here's the intro coming onto the screen. You hear the music. And as best as your little child mind can, focus in. Take in all the different colors and shapes, the movement happening on the screen, the rise and fall of the fast-tempoed music. Notice how it makes you feel. Notice if there are any thoughts that might run through your mind. If you find yourself getting pulled away, that's okay, that's expected. Just bring your attention back to that TV screen, watching the animated series intro. See if there's anything about it that you may not have paid attention to before, and really just appreciating each moment. And when you're ready, I want you to imagine that the intro's wrapping up and that title screen for whatever episode is starting to pop up for you. And we're going to say goodbye to our childhood selves. But first, I want you to just have a moment of appreciation for whatever Batman the Animated Series was for you growing up. And imagine yourself saying thank you to both the series and your childhood self. And just saying thank you for this moment, this memory. And when you're ready, I want you to take another few deep breaths to help you prepare to shift from your childhood self back to wrapping up the podcast. And as you come back into this room, maybe just shifting in your seat a little bit, opening your eyes, refocusing when you're ready, and we'll check in, see what you guys thought.
That was lovely. Thank you.
I really like
Absolutely.
that one. I really like that one. I did. It's very very nostalgic, and like, I mean, so many times Amelia will lead me through these and I will get distracted but come
Of
back.
course.
But like this one, it was funny because when I was imagining watching Batman the animated series, it actually took me back to where I always used to watch it. I always used to
Ah,
watch it. I would get off the school bus at my grandma's, and she had this really old tube TV with one of the like wooden frames around
Wow.
it
yes.
and like the clicker that you had to turn the channel on. And I just is a things were easy then, but at the
Mm.
same time, it's one of those things like you hear that Elfman score and you're just kind of just taken back and just things are simple, and after that you're like, okay, I've calmed
Music's a
down, whatever's going on. Yeah, music is just so
I
good.
definitely heard the music so
Yes,
like strongly, prominently
it's so
in my
prominent.
mind,
mm-hmm.
even more so than like the vivid imagery, which I know we've seen so many times. The
Yes,
music was definitely the foregrounded
yes.
concept that kept coming back to me. And I felt like you, there's the nostalgia, there's the comfort. For me, there's also a little bit of loneliness, and I'm
Mm.
experiencing that if folks are open to mindfulness, there is a non-judgmental component to this, that
Yes.
it when I tapped into that loneliness, I didn't judge that. I didn't accuse myself of anything. I wasn't feeling shameful about it. I just noted, like, yeah, that was something I treasured and loved, but also
Mm-hmm.
didn't really share that with other friends at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But now I get to share it with you, and I know we're connected around that, and that's just incredibly validating and affirming.
Yes.
That's
I
awesome.
Oh my gosh, I cannot thank you enough for this. This has been absolutely amazing. I was gonna ask, where can we find you? I know the Arkham Sessions podcast. I know you can download that, but what else is going on for you out there, Drea?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me on the show and welcoming me into this lovely conversation. And thanks to your listeners who have been joining us. You can find me on social media. My identity is Arkham Asylum Doc, which isn't too surprising if you've been listening to this show. So you can find me on Twitter and Instagram under that. So I'm Arkham Asylum Doc. And then my website is actually the place where all of my articles, my podcasts, my appearances, like Comic-Con stuff, and my consulting businesses. So my website is drdreapsychology.com. And then Keaton, thanks so much for mentioning the Arkham Sessions again. You can find the Arkham
Mm.
Sessions on iTunes, Stitcher, anywhere that you listen to podcasts. And we're about to wrap up Star Wars. So we're covering the ninth film.
Oh wow.
For better or worse, we will dig into that next.
No comments, no comments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Well, we'll
yeah,
keep our mouths
it
shut.
is a movie.
It is a
It's
movie,
a
and
movie.
there's a lot to talk about. And then we are actually going to switch gears because our Patreon members have voted for our next, basically like the genre or the IP we're covering next. And they have voted for Star Trek. So we're
Ooh.
covering the Star Trek films next. And we're starting with the motion picture, which is our original cast,
Yep.
Captain Kirk and Spock and all the gang. So we're excited for that. And if you love either Star Wars or Star Trek or Batman, check out the Arkham Sessions.
Awesome. Awesome. I was also gonna say, avid comic book reader. You are
Oh
in
yeah.
the
Oh,
DC
that's right.
universe.
We
You were
forgot to
you
even
were
mention
you
that.
were Batgirl psychologist, and on
Mm-hmm.
top of that, you are a doctor in Gotham that is not a supervillain. I think that is
That is
For
high
something
now.
praise.
that can be celebrated. You're not a supervillain, and you're not in a romantic relationship with Batman. I feel like that's something that always
Eh.
happens. We've talked
I
about it before.
know,
Like
right?
whenever there's a therapist in a show, like I think we touched on you touched on a little bit in your Batman Forever episode with Nicole Kidman's character. Like
Mm-hmm. Yep.
it's always so funny when they introduce those characters and they have so often they have inappropriate relationships with their patients. It just drives Amelia up the wall. It's so much fun.
Drives me
It's
up
there,
so
there
many
are
miles.
so many things that they do wrong. My biggest gripe about that film with Dr. Chase is that we said this on the show, when they're at the circus and all this stuff is happening, there's a crisis going on, she doesn't really get involved. And we had sort of that conversation on our show about, as a helper, as a professional licensed helper, and you're just like doing something for fun, you're attending the circus, and you see all sorts of things happen. Do you step in? Do you participate in some sort of like grief and loss offering? Do you help people? Do you let people know what can you do? And I really was kind of judgy about Dr. Chase. I wanted her to be a little bit more in her role as a psychologist and not so kind of like I don't know, what withdrawn about it. She was kind
Yeah.
of not really with it, and I took offense to that.
You
Yeah.
know, it is interesting because she meets with Bruce, but I feel like in that movie it's probably Dick that needs to meet with her and have a conversation more than
Yes.
anything, right?
Yes, it's weird. And I will say, I do want to plug one more thing. If folks are into the DC animated films, which honestly are often very well written and very true to
Yeah.
their source material.
Yes.
You can find my work on The Doom That Came to Gotham, which is an
Ah,
adaptation of the comic book. And there are there's like a brief documentary that accompanies the Blu-ray, DVD, and
okay.
streaming film, and I say a bunch of things there. So please check it out and continue to support your local comic book shop. Ask them if they
Yes.
have Batgirl number 16 or number 20, and let them know there's a psychologist that's portrayed in the comic and you're interested in purchasing it.
Yeah. And we did an episode on you
We
in the
did.
comic. So if people say, "Oh shoot, what did she say on that?" Just look at our list of podcast episodes in season
Awesome.
2,
Yep.
and Dr. Letamendi is in there, Batgirl's therapist, and it lists what issues those are. But yes, local comic book store, absolutely.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Well, thank
Awesome.
you
Thank you so much.
so much for coming and joining us. This has been an honor. It's been so much fun, and I hope we get to do it again sometime. Honestly, I do
Yeah.
love to do it again sometime. But yes, thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Thanks for nerding out with us. I'm clinical psychologist Dr. Amelia Brown.
And I'm educator and comic aficionado Keaton Hopkins. Check out my TV and movie reviews on YouTube at Team JVS. Check out our website at bat-therapy.com, our Bat Therapy YouTube channel, and follow us on social media. And don't forget our Patreon page at patreon.com/battherapy. See you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.